Hi there, you're listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast, Episode 106, Jewish Literature in the Hellenistic Age. The story of Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, and the purification of the Great Temple, and the dedication of the altar, and further the wars against Antiochus Epiphanes and his son Eupator, and the appearances that came from heaven to those who fought bravely for Judaism, so that though few in number, they seized the whole land, and pursued the barbarian horde, and regained possession of the temple, famous throughout the world, and liberated the city, and re-established the laws that were about to be abolished, while the Lord with great kindness became gracious to them. End quote. So begins the book of 2 Maccabees, which tells the story of the Maccabean revolt and the festival of Hanukkah, celebrated each year by millions of Jews worldwide. It is perhaps the most famous event associated with the Seleucid dynasty, and led the way to an independent Judean kingdom under the Hasmonean family. Paradoxically, it was a relatively insignificant event at the time, but in the broader history of Judaism and much of the Greco-Roman Near East, its effects would be felt for centuries afterwards. While we will be covering the revolt as part of the larger story of the Seleucid Empire, I think it is also worth dedicating a few episodes to give context to the history of the Jews living in the Hellenistic age. Among the various peoples outside of the Greco-Roman tradition, there is an astonishing amount of literary material written from the Jewish point of view about the events that transpired following the death of Alexander the Great. Many of these works, written both during and after the Hellenistic period, are often categorized within the broader field of biblical studies, but scholars and classicists have increasingly relied upon them as valuable resources. While there is always a myriad of complications using any ancient text to reconstruct history, the scriptural nature of these writings can potentially lead to serious challenges in how we ought to interpret them, often bundled with more modern attitudes towards the reliability of anything deemed religious. Since we are going to become intimately familiar with these works and authors over the next several episodes, and because they are valuable to study in of themselves, I would like to spend a full discussion on some of the Jewish texts of the Hellenistic age. To be completely transparent, I'm approaching this topic from an entirely secular perspective and background, but my aim is not to disparage their spiritual or religious significance. Any of the passages I cite relating to biblical text will be from the New Revised Standard Version, particularly the 5th edition of the New Oxford Annotated Bible with the Apocrypha. While perhaps lacking the same literary gravitas as the King James Version, this translation is a standard text used for religious studies in English. It also contains many annotations, essays, and maps to provide context for the reader, and is very accessible. Contrary to my mission statement earlier, we must focus first on a source who is not of the Hellenistic period, nor is traditionally considered part of Scripture, but is probably the most well-known Jewish writer of antiquity. Titus Flavius Josephus, birth name Yosef ben Mattiyahu, was a Jewish aristocrat and historian of the 1st century AD. Born in 37 AD as the second son of a prominent priestly family of Jerusalem, his mother's ancestry went back to the Hasmonean dynasty. Judea was under Roman dominion at this time, and Josephus himself made a personal visit to the Emperor Nero in Rome to bargain for the release of imprisoned priests in 62-63. Unfortunately, he had returned home in 65 to find Jerusalem in a state of general unrest, and in the next year he found himself thrust into the Jewish war after being appointed a commander, albeit a reluctant one, of the rebelling forces in Galilee and Gaulantis. In the spring of 67, soon-to-be Emperor Vespasian arrived in Judea as the commander ordered to pacify the region. One by one, the cities fell, and Josephus's men retreated to the fortress settlement of Jotapata, modern Yodfat, where they were besieged by 3 legions. After 47 days, the Romans managed to break in through the walls and slaughtered many of its inhabitants while enslaving the rest. Rather than being tortured or displayed in triumph, the rebel leaders took their own lives by drawing lots to run each other through with their swords. Only 2 men were left standing, one of them being Josephus, who survived the grisly process by which he attributed to divine intervention. He was taken to the Roman camp and presented to Vespasian, but Josephus proclaimed that he would be freed by his captor, who was not going to be a mere general, but an emperor. 2 years later, he was released, on account of Vespasian winning the Roman Civil War of 69, and entered into the service of the new emperor's son, Titus. Following the destruction of the temple in 70 at the hands of the Romans, he was taken to Rome and remained there for the rest of his life, patronized by the Flavian dynasty, a name he adopted until his death circa 100 AD. During his time with the Flavians, Josephus dedicated the rest of his life to becoming a prolific author, especially thanks to his literary patron Epaphroditus. We know of 4 works produced by him: The Jewish War, The Antiquities of the Jews, his autobiography known as the Vita or the Life, and Against Apion. All were written in Greek, though it is possible he had Aramaic originals that have since been lost. His earliest and most famous work is The Jewish War, probably composed only a few years after his arrival in Rome, and is an account of the affairs of Judea from Antiochus IV leading up to and during the Jewish revolt from 66 to 74 AD. The most ambitious of his writings was The Antiquities of the Jews, a massive 20-volume work which covers the story of the Jews from God's creation of the universe until about 66-67 AD, a time frame measuring approximately 5,000 years of history, as Josephus proudly explains. Books 1 through 11 deal chiefly with the biblical history of the Jews, as recounted by the stories of the Hebrew Bible from Genesis to Chronicles. By the end of Book 11, we get the introduction of Alexander the Great and his supposed visit to Jerusalem. Books 12 through 14 then relate the history of Hellenistic Judea from the death of Alexander until the rise of Herod the Great in the mid-1st century BC, and the remaining 6 books chronicle the events ending just before the outbreak of the Jewish War during the reign of the Emperor Nero. The Vita is his autobiography, meant probably as an appendix to the Antiquities. Against Apion was the last, a defense of Judaism written largely in response to a Hellenized Egyptian scholar known as Apion, who apparently was a harsh critic of the Jews and contributed to the escalation of tensions thanks to his appeals to the Emperor Caligula. In effect, it serves as a sequel to the Antiquities, as he elaborates on points he made earlier in those works. What were Josephus' sources? It is evident that he consulted a wide variety of documents, writings, and his own personal knowledge of the affairs of Judea to construct his work. With reference to Hellenistic authors, he names Polybius, Livy, Agatharchides of Cnidus, the Babylonian astronomer Berosus, Strabo the geographer, and others. One of his most prominent sources was Nicolaus of Damascus, a Greek who served in the court of Herod the Great, and wrote a now-lost history that was extensively relied on by Josephus during his account of the 1st century BC. Josephus must have had access to city archives, since he quotes verbatim the royal correspondence and decrees of Hellenistic kings like Antiochus III, which stands up to the scrutiny of epigraphists who find them to be consistent with discovered documents. Within the sphere of Hebrew writings, references to scripture are boundless. The first half of the Antiquities is largely paraphrasing the stories of the Hebrew Bible, only breaking off following Book 11 when he gets to the time of Alexander. His coverage of the Maccabean revolt does utilize both 1st and 2nd Maccabees, attempting to synchronize both accounts into a coherent narrative, though to varying degrees of success. Last of all, his background as a Jewish aristocrat gave him first-hand knowledge of the region of Judea. His experience as a commander provides an eyewitness account of several political and military events in his lifetime, and his connection to the Flavians enabled him to access to a deeper level of sources that might otherwise not have easily been in reach. We cannot understate Josephus' importance as a historian. His focus is primarily on the history of Judea and the Jews at large, which may overinflate our perception of Jerusalem's importance in the political framework of the Eastern Mediterranean. But through his Antiquities, we get the only continuous narrative of the Hellenistic and Roman Near East from Alexander the Great to the Flavian dynasty. As we lose the likes of Polybius and Livy, he is instrumental in chronicling the affairs of the Seleucids and Ptolemies, who become increasingly isolated to the Levant and Egypt throughout the latter half of the 2nd century BC. Beyond the Jews, Greeks, and Romans, Josephus provides us with rare evidence on many peoples, especially those who lived on the borders of Judea. This includes the Nabateans, Syrians, Etrurians, Parthians, and many others who we would otherwise know very little about. Josephus' unique circumstance also offers us a fascinating parallel between him and Polybius of Megalopolis. Both were men of aristocratic origin, with political careers that were cut short thanks to conflict with Rome. After being taken into custody, they attached themselves to the most powerful families of their day, the Scipios in the time of Polybius and the Flavians for Josephus, and were given the opportunity to compose histories of events that they were partially eyewitnesses to. For Polybius, his history was aimed at a Greek audience and intended to explain the astonishing rise of the Roman Republic to the status of world power. Josephus, on the other hand, had been living in a world that had been politically dominated by Rome for nearly 200 years, and culturally dominated by Hellenism for another 200 years on top of that. This is evident in Josephus himself, who writes in Greek and uses phrasing that portrays a clear influence to the likes of Thucydides when it comes to political terminology and concepts. Though equipped with an extensive education in Greco-Roman literature, we find a writer who was deeply conscious of his Jewish background, and in the broader context where Greek culture and Roman law were seen as the supreme aspects of civilization, Josephus was committed to celebrating the achievements of his people, and the legitimacy of the Torah as being on par with anything produced in the Greco-Roman world. He begins his Antiquities by explaining why he set out to write. Quote, "Now I have undertaken the present work, as thinking it will appear to all the Greeks worthy of their study, for it will contain all our antiquities, and the constitution of our government, as interpreted out of the Hebrew scriptures. They indeed contain in them the history of 5,000 years, in which time happened many strange accidents, many chances of war, and great actions of the commanders, and mutations of the form of our government. Upon the whole, a man that will peruse this history may principally learn from it that all events succeed well, even to an incredible degree, and the reward of felicity is proposed by God." End quote. As he states, his intention was to explain to his predominantly Greek-speaking audience how the holy books of the Bible were equally valuable for the study of history as the works of Thucydides or Herodotus were. Not only were they a series of laws and teachings used to guide, they were also a national history for the Jewish people. This was unique among the Semitic-speaking peoples of the Near East, and even when compared to the Greeks, who supposedly lacked any centralized body of canon, the Jews had a mostly agreed-upon set of works in the form of the Bible. Josephus' concern about upholding the legitimacy of his people is understandable. As we will discuss in the next episode, the opinions of Greeks and Romans on the Jews could range from exotic curiosity to outright mockery. After the sacking of the temple and additional punishments faced for the rebellion against Rome, such beliefs would only become more negative. And so, Josephus had ample motivation to correct the misinformation that was becoming popular with rising tensions. Later on in Against Apion, he defends his position by more directly vocalizing his grievances. Quote, "However, since I observe a considerable number of people giving ear to the reproaches that are laid against us, the Jews, by those who bear ill will to us, and will not believe what I have written concerning the antiquity of our nation, while they take it for a plain sign that our nation is of a late date, because they are not so much as vouchsafed a bare mention by the most famous historiographers among the Grecians, how can it then be other than an absurd thing for the Greeks to be so proud, and to vaunt themselves to be the only people that are acquainted with antiquity, and that have delivered the true accounts of those early times after an accurate manner?" End quote. He is not perfect as an author, however. His skills at synthesizing his many sources have come under fire, and Josephus' outlook on the political history of Judea and the surrounding regions may be colored by the relatively recent turbulence of the late Republic, where civil wars and parties steered events in those areas, and as such he retroactively may be applying concepts in a time where they didn't necessarily exist. Unfortunately, Josephus' reputation as an author during his own time, and that following his death is quite obscure. Although the biographer Suetonius knew of Josephus' existence, there are no direct citations of his work by Roman writers until the late 3rd century. Ironically, despite his passionate defense of Judaism, his works do not seem to have been of interest to many Jews either. His questionable survival of Jotapata and later service to the Flavians has not made him a terribly sympathetic figure, but he found an eager audience in the newly emerging group of Christians. Josephus provides us with one of, if not the earliest references to Jesus of Nazareth outside of the Gospels, and his accounts of Judea in the time of Jesus provided an excellent resource for the earliest Christian scholars, such as Eusebius of Caesarea. We will become increasingly acquainted with the historian as we move to the later Hellenistic period, where his value as a resource demonstrates itself ever more. While the work of Josephus delves heavily into the biblical texts, let us turn to the writings of the books that are firmly placed within the sphere of the Bible. It is also important that we establish an understanding about the terminology that we are going to employ. Some of these are used interchangeably, though not always correctly. And to give a more accurate picture, let us break down the various definitions in a relatively simplified manner. In Judaism, the Torah, literally instruction or law, refers to the compilation of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Alternatively, these are also known as the 5 books of Moses, and in Greek they are called the Pentateuch, 5 books. The Torah serves as the core of Jewish belief, offering a mixture of laws and teachings that are believed to be divinely inspired works. Building upon this, the first 24 books of the Hebrew Bible are known collectively as the Tanakh and divided into 3 parts: the Torah, prophets, and writings. Sometime in the early 3rd century BC, the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, and this edition is known as the Septuagint, the 70 or of the 70, or the Greek Old Testament. However, the Septuagint is not the same as the Hebrew Bible. The idea of an Old and New Testament is a division used exclusively within Christian doctrine. The Old Testament incorporates the 24 books that are found in the Hebrew Bible, but rearranges their order and adds additional works depending upon the sect. A total of 39 books are found in the Protestant Bible, 46 among Catholics, and up to 49 in Eastern Orthodoxy. Some of these works are designated as apocrypha, hidden books, writings that are recognized as being part of the biblical tradition, but their canonization came later than the foundational texts and occupy a sort of secondary position, deuterocanonical. Not all sects accept this either. The Apocrypha is canonized in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, subsequently declared non-canonical by Protestants, and never were part of the Hebrew Bible to begin with, and thus automatically disqualified from being divinely inspired works in Judaism. With all this in mind, let us begin with the first, and perhaps most complex text, the Book of Daniel. As I was watching, a male goat appeared from the west, coming across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. The goat had a horn between its eyes. It came toward the ram with the 2 horns that I had seen standing beside the river, and it ran at it with savage force. There was no one who could rescue the ram from its power. Then the male goat grew exceedingly great, but at the height of its power, the great horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 prominent horns toward the 4 winds of heaven." End quote. This rather curious passage comes from the 8th chapter of the Book of Daniel, describing one of the many visions experienced by the eponymous Jewish hero. The Book of Daniel is perhaps the most unique book to discuss, as it is highly regarded as evidence of divine prophecy and one of the earliest examples of apocalyptic literature. The structure of the book focuses on the experiences of Daniel, a young Jewish nobleman who was captured during the conquest of Jerusalem by the Babylonian ruler Nebuchadnezzar II, and taken to the king's court in Babylon along with 4 of his companions in about 586 BC. As hostages kept in relative comfort, the youths refused the offers of food and drink to avoid defilement, choosing to subsist only on vegetables and water. Thanks to their devotion to God's laws, they remain healthy, and are forced into additional tests of their faith, as the king tries to have them thrown into a furnace for not worshipping a golden statue in his honor, yet miraculously they survive. Throughout all of this, Nebuchadnezzar experiences unusual visions that the Babylonian wise men cannot accurately explain, but Daniel's insightful interpretations reveal the correct answers, earning him the king's respect. A few years later, a ghostly apparition appears at the feast of the crown prince Belshazzar, where a disembodied hand writes the words Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin for all to see. Only Daniel could translate the meaning of this writing, which actually was in Hebrew. Belshazzar has insulted God through his arrogant misuse of treasures from the Temple of Jerusalem, and warned that the kingdom's days were numbered, giving us the origin of the proverbial writing on the wall. True to the expression, Darius the Mede conquers Babylon and slays Belshazzar that very same night. Daniel's service continues under Darius as a high official, but jealous courtiers trick the great king into throwing him into a den of lions. Yet again, Daniel's piety delivers him unharmed the next morning, much to the joy of Darius, who tosses the false accusers to the beasts for their crimes in turn. Chapters 1 through 6 covers this most famous part of the Daniel story, but chapters 7 through 12 take a very different approach. Over a period of a few years, our protagonist experiences several dreams and visions, perhaps better described as revelations. First, he witnesses the arrival of 4 beasts emerging from the sea that are then destroyed by the Ancient of Days, i.e. God. His second vision shows him a battle between a 2-horned ram and a 1-horned goat, next followed by the Archangel Gabriel delivering a cryptic prophecy about the desolation of Jerusalem lasting 70 weeks. Then one final vision is experienced by Daniel, prophesizing the rise of a warrior king who conquers Persia, but whose own empire shatters shortly afterwards, and is then split between the king of the north and the king of the south, who will do battle until the end of days. Jerusalem itself will suffer, as the king of the north will commit atrocities against the Holy Covenant, but the end of days will come, resulting in the resurrection of the faithful dead and the demise of the sinful Gentile nations. Who wrote the book of Daniel? A literal interpretation would suggest that Daniel himself penned it sometime during the mid to late 6th century BC. Passages within the work include references that he wrote down his own observations, and he occasionally addresses himself in the first person. Josephus also asserts that a copy of the book was presented to Alexander the Great during his visit to Jerusalem, and its prophecies of a Greek victory over Persia impressed him enough to pay sacrifice to the Jewish god, thus dating it to before the late 4th century. However, claims of a gift of prophecy and other supernatural abilities do not typically hold much water in a more secular worldview, and scholars have combed over the work to find clues of its origins and date its composition. Looking over the text at large, the book can be separated into 2 halves, chapters 1 through 6 and chapters 7 through 12 respectively, the former covering Daniel's exploits and the latter his series of revelations. Linguistically, the text is written in Hebrew, chapters 1 verse 1 through chapters 2 verse 3, Aramaic, chapters 2 verse 4 through chapter 7 verse 28, and then Hebrew again, chapters 8 through 12 in their entirety. Aramaic had been adopted as a lingua franca throughout the Near East and Iranian plateau following the Persian conquest in the 6th century BC, and there are about 19 loanwords taken from Persian terminology in the Aramaic portion of the text, but the Hebrew is consistent with late Hebrew that was used throughout the Hellenistic and Roman periods. This would suggest that much of the second half of the book was a later insertion by one or more writers, but we must look for additional evidence of its date of publication as well. In roughly 180 BC, a Jewish scholar by the name of Ben Sirach wrote a work entitled Ecclesiasticus, or the wisdom of Ben Sirach. This apocryphal text is not considered part of the Hebrew Bible, but along with the model of ethics it touts, the book provides scholars with one of the earliest accounts of the Jewish canon. In chapters 44 through 50, Ben Sirach lists the achievements of heroic Jews from most of the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, but one of the most notable absences from his list is Daniel. Yet when we look at 1 Maccabees, written about 80 years later, Daniel is counted among these canonical heroes. Thus we might presume that Daniel's introduction into the canon, and thereby its partial composition, took place during this time frame. Beyond linguistic analysis and date of publication, one of the most debated elements are Daniel's revelations. It is hard not to notice that his prophetic claims are often parallel to the events that we've discussed in the earlier narratives, and for many, this is acceptable evidence of his supernatural abilities, or more specifically, God's intervention. However, cracks begin to form when these passages are placed under historiographical scrutiny, but we don't have to look to the modern era for a skeptical opinion of Daniel's authorship. In the 3rd century AD, a Neoplatonist philosopher named Porphyry of Tyre, alternatively Porphyrius, wrote a commentary on the Book of Daniel as part of a larger criticism of the emerging Christian doctrine, known as Against the Christians. Because it was banned during the reign of Constantine the Great, there are no extant copies of the work that survive. Ironically, it was preserved in part by later Christian writers in their counterattacks against him. According to the sources, Porphyry analyzed the various prophecies and traced them to historical persons and events. He asserted that these were not written by Daniel himself, but rather a Jewish writer who lived during the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. His arguments rest on the fact that the prophecies themselves are more or less correct until the reign of Epiphanes, where they become especially detailed and are easily cross-referenced, until reaching a certain point where the prophecy differs sharply with the actual history. Not all of Porphyry's interpretations are accurate, but he does have remarkably astute insights. To demonstrate, let us look at chapter 11, the most detailed and straightforward of the revelations. Here, Daniel's visions declares that 4 more kings of Persia would rule from the time of Darius the Mede, each one richer than the rest, until the last one attacks Greece. A warrior king from this land would rise in response, acquiring great power until the time when his own kingdom is broken and divided among the 4 winds, not to be inherited by his own descendants. Though the number of Persian rulers presented is incorrect, this account reasonably summarizes the rise of Alexander the Great and the subsequent shattering of his empire at the hands of his generals following his death. Starting from verse 5, we then get the first mention of a king of the south and king of the north, the Ptolemies of Egypt and Seleucids of Syria respectively. Nearly a century of conflict and political turmoil are recounted across the next several verses, the events known to us as the Syrian Wars, but are simplified explanations. By verse 14, the revelation becomes more detailed as we move towards the 2nd century, reciting the events of the 4th and 5th Syrian Wars, the reign of Seleucus IV, and even referring to the incident with Heliodorus in Jerusalem. Yet it is during the reign of Antiochus IV where we get the most accurate series of events presented to us. Verses 21 through 24 document the rise of Antiochus as a usurper king to the Seleucid throne, describing him as a contemptible person on whom royal majesty had not been conferred. Following his rise to power, an account of the 6th Syrian War takes place across verses 25 through 30. Remarkably, the author even makes mention of the ships of Kittim that put a halt to the king's plans and forced him to withdraw to Syria. Kittim is a general term referring to distant western lands, in earlier times being used to describe Cyprus, but in this later context it has been applied to Roman Italy. After his retreat, Antiochus attacks Jerusalem and violates the Great Temple, setting up the abomination of desolation and ending the sacrifices. This is in line with what we know of the events, but the text then deviates from the established chronology by claiming Antiochus will go to war with Egypt again and conquering as far as Libya and Nubia, before meeting his demise in the land, quote, between the sea and the beautiful holy mountain, which has been interpreted to be somewhere in Palestine. As we will learn, this is not what ended up happening, so the crisis at Jerusalem in 167 serves as the terminus antiquem, the last datable event to appear in Daniel. As I have explained, the tone and format of the book is markedly different during these later chapters. The first half is structured in a biographical style that recounts Daniel's achievements, while the second half delves into the prophecies or revelations themselves. It is notable that in the first half, Daniel himself does not give the prophecies. Rather, he interprets the prophetic dreams of others like Nebuchadnezzar and Darius. His role follows earlier models of a wise advisor interpreting the dreams of royal figures. If we seek a parallel within the confines of Scripture, we need not look further than the book of Genesis and the dream divination of the Hebrew Joseph in the court of the Pharaoh. Indeed, we might view Daniel's adventures as a collection of folk tales passed down orally from one generation to the next. Compare this to the second half of the book, where Daniel is the dreamer who experiences visions that are only understood with the intervention of the archangel Gabriel, which allows for the prophetic figure to experience divine revelation while acknowledging God as its source. It also operates within a different genre, that of apocalypse literature. While not the first to delve into it, apocalyptic literature follows a convention of revelation being mediated by a divine messenger, Gabriel in this case, granting insights to events that deal with the nature of the cosmos and ultimately, but not exclusively, eschatological themes regarding the end of days. How might we reconcile these opposing views? Most scholars would date chapters 1 through 7 to the diasporic communities during the 5th century BC, whereas chapters 8 through 12 date to somewhere from 167 to 164 BC, the product of a Jewish author writing during the reign of Antiochus IV. The goal is not to disparage the legitimacy of Daniel based on its authorship, but by gaining the context of chapters relevant to our period, we can better understand what the author's intention were and the response of the Jews to the Antiochene crisis. Perhaps the most notable difference is the change in attitudes regarding the opinion of the rulers of Gentile nations. In earlier chapters, those like Nebuchadnezzar and Darius played antagonistic roles, but ultimately are swayed by Daniel and gain at least a respect for the Jewish God. In Daniel's visions, the various Hellenistic kingdoms that appear in the form of beasts, that of Alexander, the Ptolemies, and the Seleucids, are shown to be incredibly destructive, more akin to forces of nature, as their wars ravage the land. Passages are dedicated to the violations committed against the temple by Antiochus, both in allegorical and literal form. Where once was conciliation between the Jews and their foreign overlords, there was now a battle between good and evil. Such sentiments are understandable given the outrage over the actions of the king, and furthermore, the terrible consequences of being trapped in the middle of two empires battling for control of their homelands for over a century. Yet there is also something of a positive outlook on this, for the model of succeeding empires, something that can be found in Herodotus and other Greek historians as well, will hopefully come to an end, when the kingdom of God and his people will survive as the wicked Gentile nations are destroyed. Such attitudes can be observed in near-contemporary writings. A 10-line fragment found in Qumran, written during the final decades of the 1st century BC, describes the acts of a king who will invade Egypt before turning his attention to the Temple of Jerusalem and causing harm. This ruler has been identified as Antiochus IV, and its style is remarkably similar to that of Daniel's prophecies. One of the 7 original Dead Sea Scrolls to be discovered, known as the War Scroll, speaks of a great apocalyptic battle between the Sons of Light, presumably the Jews of Qumran, and Sons of Darkness, who were in league with the nation of Kittim. These are both tied to the Roman period, but the sentiments expressed here can be traced back to the notions developing in the time of the Maccabean crisis. Much like Josephus, the Hellenistic era author of Daniel's visions was responding to the violations in the temple and interpreting them within the framework of God's larger plan. In spite of all suffering, the righteous will have their day. We now turn to the key texts that will shape much of our next few episodes, the books of the Maccabees. Many listeners may naturally assume that I am referring to only 2 separate books, but there is a bit of confusion regarding the actual number and canonicity of those works, with numbers ranging as high as 8. 1st and 2nd Maccabees are the texts that recount the story of Hanukkah and the Maccabean revolt, and are considered part of the deuterocanonical books of the Old Testament for Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, and are a part of Protestant Apocrypha. 3rd Maccabees is only recognized by Eastern Orthodoxy, and 4th Maccabees has been accepted under the Georgian Orthodox Church. None of the books of Maccabees are considered part of Jewish canon, but because they are so intimately tied with the story of Hanukkah, they remain valued texts. The rest are irrelevant for the purposes of our discussion, and the extent to which we will rely on the first 2 books means that we should be able to determine their similarities and differences from each other. 1st Maccabees was originally written in Hebrew, most likely by a court historian of the Hasmonean dynasty in Jerusalem, but the work was later translated into Greek, which is the only surviving version. Scholars have been able to deduce the approximate date of its composition to about 100 BC, based on a reference in the past tense to the career of the high priest John Hyrcanus, who died in 104. It begins with a brief summary of the breakup of Alexander's empire before immediately moving to the reign of Antiochus IV, whom the author refers to as a sinful root. His campaigns in Egypt are followed by his misdeeds in Jerusalem, before turning to the story of Mattathias of Modain and his sons, better known as the Hasmoneans. Their revolt against the Seleucid administration culminates in the reconsecration of the temple in 165, but the story follows the family down through the events of the next few decades, before ending in 135, just after the establishment of an independent Judean kingdom. 2nd Maccabees is a bit of a different animal. We know almost nothing about who wrote the work, though, as explained by the writers themselves, 2nd Maccabees is apparently an epitome of an earlier 5-volume history on Judas Maccabee and his brothers, written by one Jason of Kyrene. As his name implies, Jason was presumably a member of the diaspora, but other than this, we know nothing of the man. It is clear, though, that the epitomizer went far beyond merely summarizing Jason's account, and inserted additional elements to the story by drawing upon other writings for his own original authorship. Unlike its counterpart, it was written in Greek rather than Hebrew, and an exceedingly high caliber of Greek to boot. Because of this, it has led many to believe that its authorship may be tied to a Jew living in Alexandria, but it is also equally likely that it was composed in Jerusalem. The story it presents covers a much narrower account than that of 1st Maccabees, starting from the coronation of Antiochus IV in 175, and ending after the victory of Judas Maccabee over the Seleucid army at the Battle of Edessa in 161, leading to the establishment of the Day of Nicanor festival. It also includes an earlier story of the visit of the minister Heliodorus to the temple during the reign of Seleucus IV, plus a few events not included in 1st Maccabees. Given that they broadly cover the same period, these 2 texts are used as the primary accounts of the Maccabean revolt and its causes, but there is quite a bit of controversy as to how we are meant to interpret and employ them. Their style differs significantly from each other, and what complicates matters is the fact that each author presents us with a different sequence of events and causes of the revolt that make historical reconstruction a challenge. Of the pair, the first book is often considered a far more reliable work of history than the second. 1st Maccabees is written as a dynastic history, focusing on the deeds of the Hasmonean family and particularly that of Judas Maccabee. It was he who restored the temple after being subject to Antiochus' violations, the successor to the deposed high priests, and therefore the work serves as a propaganda piece legitimizing his descendants as the rightful rulers of an independent Jerusalem. Its author clearly had access to royal archives, as he includes testimony in the form of official documents and correspondence that have largely been accepted as genuine, though there are examples that clearly are heavily fabricated or manipulated. The details offered in battle scenes and troop movements have led some scholars to speculate that the author himself was an eyewitness to some of these events, or had a direct connection to someone who was. In comparison, II Maccabees is stylistically very different. Its structure is rather complex, as it becomes challenging for scholars to dissect II Maccabees' authorship, since although it claims to be a summary of an earlier history by Jason of Kyrene, it is clear that whoever was epitomizing the book added their own touches. Firstly, the beginning of the book is punctuated by 2 letters addressed to the Jewish communities in Egypt, encouraging the Egyptian Jews to join in the celebrations of the Hanukkah festival. These were affixed after the original work was created, but it is in this form that was transmitted via the Septuagint. Those letters are dated to the year 169 of the Seleucid era, about 143-142 BC, and the second letter refers to the Seleucid year 188 as well, 125-124 BC, which would imply that the book was published by or before 125 BC. There are also episodes of events that appear to be inserted into the original text and taken from other sources, namely the incident between Heliodorus and Onias during the reign of Seleucus IV. Additionally, its subject matter differs quite a bit. While Judas Maccabee and his brothers are key figures in the narrative, the work seems to be a history of Jerusalem itself, and more specifically, the Temple. The central event is the liberation and refoundation of the Temple by Judas, but there are multiple cycles of storytelling whereby the Temple is used to illustrate times of disharmony and illegitimacy, then subsequently followed by a restoration of order, evidenced by its attack on the various corrupt high priests during the build-up to the Maccabean revolt. The tone of the work is extensively rooted into the storytelling traditions of the Bible, focusing on miraculous interventions and other supernatural explanations, prompting some to declare it a theological history. The author also focuses less on the tactical brilliance of Judas or his companions, and more so on the manifestation of God's power, such as in the form of vengeful angels to deliver victory. Martyrdoms are also a key feature of II Maccabees, most notably the self-sacrifice of Eleazar against a Seleucid war elephant, or the story of the mother and her 7 sons tortured to death for refusing to break the covenant. Because the work appears to be more religious in nature, and because of its less straightforward narrative, scholars have historically characterized 1st Maccabees as the more objective of the pair, and therefore more valuable. Though its reputation may be weighed down by the author's supposed pious focus, 2nd Maccabees may be unfairly maligned. Despite its supposedly conservative Jewish elements, the work was written in Greek of exceedingly high caliber similar to other Hellenistic writers like Polybius, and clearly demonstrates knowledge of Greek historiographical techniques. A notable point that distinguishes 2nd Maccabees is the author's use of 2 terms, Judaismos and Hellenismos. We will delve more into the significance and meaning of its terminology in the next episodes. But this is the first instance of a Jewish author pitting the concept of Judaism against the established order of Hellenism, illustrating a complex understanding of the environment of the time. The author also had a reliable insight on the political intricacies of the period, as there are several details that are corroborated by extant archaeological discoveries and documents. In a recent work by Dr. Sylvie Honigman on 2nd Maccabees, she argues that the work's focus on the refoundation of the temple is evidence that it is also a dynastic history and pro-Hasmonean propaganda in the same vein as 1st Maccabees. For Near Eastern societies, the building and/or restoration of temples was a key part of legitimizing the rule of the current monarch and thereby damning their predecessors. For an example we've covered before, there is the famous cylinder of Antiochus I Soter celebrating his rebuilding of the temple of Borsippa to solidify the claims of the Seleucids over Babylonia. In 142-141, Simon Thassi became the supreme high priest and ethnarch, effectively the first king of the Hasmonean kingdom. Though the Hasmoneans themselves were not descended from a priestly line, with 2nd Maccabees celebrating the success of his brother Judas in refounding the temple and attacking the activities of the wicked high priests, Simon would be able to leverage it as propaganda and strengthen his family's claim to ruling Judea. Thus, we might be better suited to read both 1st and 2nd Maccabees in parallel, understanding how they both served to boost the legitimacy of the Hasmonean dynasty as the sole rulers of Judea. There are other texts and writers that we will delve more into as the series goes forward, but these are the most important to our upcoming episodes, and so we will leave it on this note. Next time, we will cover the history of the Jews from the conquest of Judea by Alexander the Great until just before the reign of Antiochus IV. So, until then, you've been listening to the Hellenistic Age Podcast.